Good evening. I'm Catherine Kennedy, the proud director of Boston University's Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground. Welcome to a conversation about Blackness, immigration, and what it means to be an American. Tonight, Professor Louis Chude-Sokei will be joined by fellow colleagues, writers, and authors. They will engage in meaningful and creative experiences around his new memoir, Floating in a Most Peculiar Way. Our program will feature two segments and a Q&A at the end. Please submit your questions in the Q&A portion of the Zoom app. We are here in the event space of the Howard Thurman Center and are following COVID safety protocol. All of the participants on stage, as well as the tech crew, are socially distanced and wearing masks. I will introduce our guests in the order of their appearance. Professor Louis Chude-Sokei is professor of English, holds the George and Joyce Wein Chair in African American Studies, and is the director of the African American Studies program at Boston University. He is a writer and award-winning scholar whose work ranges widely nationally and internationally in and around the literary, political, and cultural phenomena of the African diaspora. He is the editor-in-chief of The Black Scholar, the oldest premier journal of Black studies and research, and the author of several scholarly works, including the award-winning book, The Last Darky, Bert Williams' Black on Black Minstrelsy, and the African Diaspora. Tonight, Professor Chude-Sokei will share his memoir, Floating in a Most Peculiar Way, that traces his intellectual development across multiple nations and distinct Black cultures. Kenneth Elmore serves as the Associate Provost and Dean of Students at Boston University. He is complementing this program as our music DJ. Archelle Thelemaque is a posse scholar from Kennesaw, Georgia, graduating in the class of 2021. Archelle is a Howard Thurman Center student ambassador and is editor-in-chief of Charcoal Magazine, a student-run publication dedicated to working with student artists of color. Archelle is a radio DJ with WTBU at Boston University, co-hosting a weekly feminist talk show. She has been recognized as a Scarlet Key recipient for BU's class of 2021 and was recently awarded the BU College of Communications Inaugural Leadership Excellence in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award. I am proud to also announce that she will be the class of 2021 commencement speaker. Professor Robert Pinsky serves as a professor of English and as the director of the creative writing program at Boston University. He has published many books of poetry, translation, and criticism, including The Figured Wheel, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and his acclaimed translation, The Inferno of Dante, and his Princeton Tanner Lectures, Democracy, Culture, and the Voice of Poetry. As three-term Poet Laureate of the United States, he founded the Favorite Poem Project to document, promote, and celebrate poetry's place in American culture. In addition to the anthologies, that project has produced 50 short documentaries showcasing Americans reading and speaking about poems they love. His honors and awards are many. Professor Pinsky is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Additional honors include the Korean Manhei Award and the Italian Premio Capri. He has appeared on The Simpsons and The Colbert Report. Professor Sanjay Krishnan is an associate professor in the English department and the director of graduate studies at Boston University. He is the author of Reading the Global, Troubling Perspectives on Britain's Empire in Asia, and the V.S. Naipaul's Journeys, From Periphery to Center. Professor Krishnan is currently working on a book project that explores how Anglophone writers from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean have reflected on the legacy of decolonization from diverse points of view. Professor Hajin teaches literature and creative writing at Boston University. Born in China, he was a teenager when China entered the Cultural Revolution. He became a member of the People's Liberation Army at the age of 14. Professor Jin is an award-winning writer and poet who won the National Book Award and was finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He has published many books of fiction, poetry, and nonfiction, and his work has been translated into more than 30 languages. Professor Jin has received lots of honors, including being a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His most recent book is a biography of the 8th century Chinese poet Li Bai, The Banished Immortal. His new novel, A Song Everlasting, is forthcoming from Pantheon Books. I now welcome Associate Provost and Dean of Students, Kenneth Elmore.
Well, thank you, Catherine. So Michael Birnbaum Quintero is an associate professor of music and chair of musicology and ethnomusicology here at Boston University. We asked him to do something really wonderful. He put together the Most Peculiar Way playlist, and I'm going to be playing from that list tonight. So all this music that you hear is trying to really fuse that common understanding, maybe not so common, but an understanding of diaspora, Africa, Jamaica, Biafra, and Southern Los Angeles as well. That's Nate Dogg that you hear right there. So we're going to try and make sure that in between sets you can hear a little bit and get a feel for this book so you can also float in the most peculiar way. Take it away, Professor Pinsky.
Thank you, Catherine and Ken. It's an honor to be here while the Thurman Center honors a book that is so much in the spirit of Howard Thurman. I read passages from this book to my friends and family, and I always feel I have to warn people, don't be distracted by the fact that this is a great personal story, beautifully told. It's the story of a beautiful, ambitious young woman from Jamaica. That's one continent. She goes to London. That's a second continent. And there she meets an elegant, good-looking, important young military academy man from Sandhurst. They get married. He is a hero of a legendary civil war, a country that is born and then dies, starvation in its wake. And that story, I would say, is a vehicle for the important theme that, for me, illuminates the idea of culture. To read Louis Chude-Sokei's book is to understand that culture is not a syllabus. It's not a set of doctrines. It is a form of motion. It is a form of change. It is a shapeshifter. As a shapeshifter, it can be monstrous, as with those starving children and the violence. And as a shapeshifter, it also can save us, and it's different for every one of us. I'll try to illustrate what I mean by two of my favorite passages from this book. I'll read a wonderful, characteristically funny and complicated sentence. 5 or 6 words. Everyone and everything was there. Everyone and everything was there. The occasion is a dinner in Los Angeles, attended by various Africans, Jamaicans, some of them enemies or hostile to one another, and various generations. The generation that prides itself on one accent, and the generation that affects another when they're not around that first generation. They are all gathered at Aunt Pansy and Uncle Owen's house for lunch after church because the great hero, the president, Louis' godfather, is there. Even Uncle Irving, who despite his hostility to all things Biafra or Nigeria, did have a weakness for celebrity. It was a full house. Everyone and everywhere was there, especially Nigerians and other West Africans, and the accents and dialects were at a pitch and intensity I'd never heard before, not even for Independence Day celebrations. That is a specific, funny, almost threatening, concrete human example of what I've said about culture being by its nature in flux. The other passage I'll read from answers the question about what that has to do with a particular person. What is my culture? The protagonist of the autobiography has been a child in a Seventh-day Adventist place for children who are in an ambiguous situation. Then he goes to DC, where Jamaican aunties help him figure out America. And there he goes to Southern LA, where he needs to act like a thug to disguise the fact that he is a book reader. And he thinks he knows who he is, at least minimally, in the sense, I think I'm Robert Pinsky, or Catherine is Catherine Kennedy. He thinks he knows his name. He thinks he knows his African name. When asked what his mother, Jamaican mother, gave him for an African name, I won't pronounce it correctly, he says, but she called me Onuno Regregonmam. That is your name from your father. But my name is Onuora. Oh no, it is Onuora Negbum, your full name. Don't you know your name? That's the first part. And the first part means eloquence. The first part means I speak. I'm a voice. What is the second part? Omwara, voice of the people. Voice of the people. What about the second part? Egbunam. That means, well, something like, will always be against me. Or what people say will not stop me or kill me. So my name is the voice of the people will always be against me? This is an adult visiting his relatives in Africa. Well, maybe something like that. It means a controversial person. Your dear mom, her Igbo was never very good, but she tried. Oh, she tried. God is great. And that gives him what turns out to be his genuine identity, which is to be eloquent, speak for many people and many peoples, and not to be taking the easy, monochromatic path. That's the best I can do to introduce a book I admire greatly. And now back to Ken as DJ.
Thank you, Professor Pinsky. So just as a reminder, these are songs that were put together, a playlist that was put together by Michael Birnbaum Quintero, Associate Professor of Music and Chair of Musicology and Ethnomusicology here at Boston University. It is the most peculiar playlist that we've got. And I do think it floats. You know, here's where you've got, I think, a bit of that South-centric flair to it. And, you know, a different sort of taste to it as well. The music of my childhood as well. Although I was on the other side of the country and I thought this stuff was whack. So let me turn it right back over to Archelle and the guest of honor right now.
I think this is our cue. We can take our mask off.
It's weird seeing you without a mask on and in person after a semester of great intellectual thought. How are you?
Good, good. It's not weird being interrogated by you.
Oh, right. After, for anybody who's listening, Professor Chude-Sokei was my professor for Black Thought, or is my professor, because you said once a professor, always a professor. So now it feels weird to maybe ask you questions. But I wanted to, I say that because I think when reading this memoir, which from all the books that we read last semester and all the texts that we read, when I started to read it, the most important thing that I did was read it with your notes in mind and what you told us to look out for in a book. And when I say that, the first day of class, we read about public intellectualism, which really stuck with me. And when I started reading the book, I'm like, I'm gonna get them. I'm gonna figure out that moment where you're speaking for an audience or a specific audience and you're tailoring your message for a very specific group of people. I also looked a lot for a tragic Black male narrative, right? I was trying to see, well, where are the pitfalls, that Ta-Nehisi Coates fell into, and is he going to do the same thing? And thinking a lot about when we got into the point of the class where we're talking about the diaspora and thinking about transnationalism and the location and thinking about how you can identify race and culture and ethnicity and the differences between those. So those were my thoughts when entering the book. And I think the question that I have for you is, you make a lot of choices. Obviously, storytelling is a very deliberate art. And I think the first question that I have is, regarding your audience, when you write this book, who do you have in mind that it is for?
The easy answer is that you write a book like this for yourself. You are your ideal audience. But it's also, and I'm glad you mentioned the academic context, one of the things that happens in choosing to write a memoir at this particular moment in my life and career is because I found the academic audience to be too limiting. The academic audience may be interested in diaspora, but it's more interested in diaspora as these sort of ideological postures, which I'm committed to as well. But a memoir, you get to go down into the nitty-gritty, the dirty, the contradictory, the hypocritical, the things that don't actually sum up, because that's how life actually works. That's what the actual diaspora is like. So the audience I have for this book in mind is, to a certain extent, those who think of diaspora in a very now formal academic way, but really it's for a broader community of readers that I have known for the last 10 years is more interested in seeing diaspora outside of academic frameworks, right? This is a book that tells my own story, but it uses my own story because I believe that I speak to, if not for, certainly two generations of Black immigrants who have emerged since the 1960s, certainly after 1965. They have arrived in the United States. Many have come from genocidal backgrounds or from political and cultural instability, right? And then they arrive in multiple countries before they get to the United States. That's not that unique anymore. And so I'm telling the story to an audience, I hope, that is looking for narratives that speak to them as new kinds of Black people in the United States who are straddling African-American culture and traditions and a new inchoate sense of Blackness that hasn't been yet defined, right? So I think of those folks when I'm writing this book, as well as the previous community of African-Americans who I think need a kind of challenge to their sense of diaspora and race and politics.
And I'm happy you said that, because when I was reading the memoir, a big part of it, I felt like you were preaching to the choir, because all that you describe, my parents are immigrants from Haiti, and I grew up in the United States, and there are really prominent moments in the book, in the memoir, excuse me, I'm making sure I'm using the proper terminology, that when you speak about you're at the dinner table, which is, I have many questions about the dinner table, but I'll start here. You're at the dinner table and there's the point where people begin discussing Black Americans. And Black Americans in any immigrant household, in mine, it sounds like in yours and in many, is Black Americans, we are not Black Americans to our parents. And I think that was a point in the book where I was very like, I feel seen in this moment, and not in other texts by Black authors that I've read in the past. So that I think that is very clear and evident in the
As
work.
I say in the book, you know, Black immigrants think about African Americans in the way that African Americans think about white people. Right? And so there's a kind of obsession with African Americans, trying to figure them out, trying to navigate them, trying to become them on the part of us younger ones. But of course, the older ones are trying to prevent us from becoming that way. And so they send us back to our homelands for punishment. Right? This is, as I said in my previous answer, this is not that unique. So for you to feel seen, a lot of people, I think, are feeling seen in this book because it's a Blackness that is not, it's not small. These numbers are not small. You know, a major fact of all of my writing, from the memoir to my scholarship, is that since 1990, more Africans have arrived in the United States than during the slave trade. Over the last few decades, more and more Black folks have come from all over. And so it's really challenging Blackness to transform and grow, and it's doing that. Right? However, we don't have conversations about it, right? And so that's what I want to do, because Black immigrants, as you're suggesting in your own family, they talk about this stuff all the time, right? And it's not a nice conversation sometimes. It's not polite, right? And so I wanted to create a context where what I grew up seeing and feeling and learning around the dining table with my family was in conversation with what I was studying in college and university around Black diaspora and racial politics. Bring them into conversation with each other, which is a goal here.
Right, and I think that's so clear. And the question, and well, more point in question that I have here is, when you think about what the book is about, right? And that's a very, it's difficult to pinpoint.
Yes.
That in itself is floating in a way. But I think one of the moments that was really stuck out for me as well is that the way that you engage with white people in the book. It's not, the book's not about Black and white relations. It's about interracial conflict, relationships, the good, the bad, the sometimes the really ugly.
Yeah.
And I think when you're thinking about that choice you made and how you would bring in white people to a narrative that often, when you think about Black people, it's black and white.
Yes, indeed.
But here it's not black and white. What was the reasoning behind that choice?
The reason behind the choice to bring white people into the narrative?
To bring white people in the way that you did, in almost a sub-character role.
Well, okay, great question. Because back to what I said a second ago, as a Black immigrant in the United States, right, there are at least two distinct Americas. One is a Black one and one is a white one. And they have different rules and they have different expectations, right? So I wanted to tell the story of someone who sees America as a choice between, do you want to assimilate here or assimilate there? Or can you assimilate into both? Well, what does this group think if you assimilate into both or that one? Indeed, what does this group, the Black American group, think about the fact that you think you have a choice to determine which way you assimilate? So, and it's important to bring whites into that to represent the multiple Americas. But I bring whites in the book, into the book the way I do, because these are mostly teachers, right? Good and bad teachers, or in some cases, bad teachers who ended up doing good things. Right? Or, for example, I've had a conversation with someone about some of these sections in the book, and the person kept saying, but this person was racist, right? And I said, yes, but she got me into science fiction. Right? But she was racist, right? And I'm like, yes, but she also did this thing, right? And that complexity, I think, comes from being a Black immigrant, where them being racist is not enough to prevent you from interacting with them, perhaps out of naivete and ignorance, but it still is true to that experience. Because for you, the prejudice from this group is always mediated by what you see as the xenophobia and prejudice of the other group, right? And so the white characters, the Black characters, they're all complex equally for this sort of immigrant perspective, until you learn later on that, oh, wait a minute, she may have done nice things for me, but that was actually quite racist, right? You didn't know that earlier, right? And so the book is about learning about these different expectations from these different Americas.
Right, right. And you talk about the teachers, the coach. I
coach.
think the coach was, when you spoke about the coach, this relationship that you had with her, I thought was really interesting in that, you know, in the class, in the gymnasium, in the classroom, locker room, she treated you just like everybody else. But then it was more of a secretive, I have this box of books for you. Yeah. And I think that in itself is a lot of complexity as well, because it demonstrates a lot of how relationships between Black and white people actually unfold, where maybe externally it's, I don't know you, I'm going to treat you just like everybody else, but then there's a softer side, a more intimate side.
I understand how you are seen publicly, and I will respect how you are seen publicly, even though it might seem racist, but privately, I will respect what I know to be true about you that I can't share with the public. That kind of back and forth is, I think, throughout the book with the different white characters. But then, of course, there are those white characters who are not as respectful of those differences. But then there are also African-American characters that are not as respectful of those differences. And that's the experience of not just being an immigrant, but also I'm telling the story about learning and to become fluent in American racial politics for good and for ill, right? And so the story is someone learning, how do Black people think about race? How do white people think about race? How do I work it both, right? And that's really the story. And I could tell it in a memoir because as a memoir, it's about a young person who doesn't know everything yet, right? If I were telling these stories in an academic setting, I have to sort of lead with ideology, right? I have to lead with the politics and the analysis. I didn't want to do that here.
You tell a coming of age story, yeah. And we go through that with you. And I think one of the other choices that I thought that really, again, was really prominent and stuck out for me was how you decided to discuss gender, but not in, it was, I want to say unusual. I hadn't seen this done before, and maybe it's because I'm not in the academic space, right? Or as
well, neither is this book.
Right. So that's why I think for me, I thought the choice that you made about how you discuss gender, when you speak about immigrants, they are presented women. You identify immigration or immigrants as women.
Yes.
And then Black American is where you find your manhood.
Or where you look for it.
Where you look for your manhood. And often there's even the point where you make it all the way in your graduate career and you're at this peak in your manhood. And that's when you're also at the peak of I think you're fully immersed into your racial consciousness at that point. So I'm wondering why that choice to gender immigrant and Black American?
Now, as a scholar, I could bring out the statistics because different waves of immigration are gendered, right? For example, my mother's generation, a lot of them were nurses, and that was definitely gendered. That's who she went to the UK with, right? My father's generation, they were all soldiers, and so that's gendered as well. But also, as I mentioned in the book, there are a number of my family and extended family members whose parents, whose fathers were under house arrest or disappeared politically, right? So we have that missing male narrative, which is a bit of a cliche sometimes, but very different here. It's not the prison and all these other stereotypes and actual statistical facts in some cases, except for my cousin who I talk about in the book. He crosses over into that space. But that gendering of immigration is also, it's not just historically true, but it's also true to my experience. The story is about someone who is surrounded by aunties. And I don't think that, I'm sure you feel seen by that as well. It's a very Caribbean and African thing. Right? It's a real thing. And so it's telling that story, but when you're surrounded by aunties and you come from cultures where the stereotype may be that they're suppressed and marginalized, but not if you're in the Caribbean or in West Africa. Women have an incredibly powerful space and place, right? And I wanted to honor that, but I wanted to honor it by telling the story of someone who is so overwhelmed by his aunties and that they seem so interchangeable all over the world that all he can do is dream about men, right? He's looking for men. And so when I arrive in the United States, men are the brothers on the street, the gang members, and that's not unusual either. That's where a lot of African-American masculinity gets constructed in a kind of urban and public space. However, I want to tell the story of someone who misunderstands gender, as most of us do, right? So busy looking for women, thinking that men are going to sort of save him from immigration or from moving all over the place and from being called the N-word and things like that that are in the book, that he doesn't realize that the people doing the work all the time to sustain and move him from place to place and keep him going are in fact women. I wanted that to stand out. But it's also the point that so much of my generation, I might be hopefully the last generation for whom Black radical thought is so deeply masculinized. I might be, and hopefully the last generation, but you know that my generation, the generation before, Black masculinity was the definition of Black radical thought and attitude, right? Which is what I encounter in college, right?
Militants is very masculine.
Exactly, and so this is someone who's discovering all of that, and again, hopefully I'm the last generation for which that's the case.
And still on this topic of gender, the way, again, it's all brilliant and all pieced together very in a really, I'm gonna stop myself before.
I tell people that I hate cliches as much as I hate racism.
Right.
And I so avoid both.
Right, and I don't think while reading it, that's why I went in and I opened, right? I said, I'm looking for Black public intellectualism. I didn't find, I couldn't say that at this point you're speaking to white people. Even in your references to David Bowie, it wasn't there for me, it wasn't clear. It was just, you are a person who is a fanatic of David Bowie. And bringing it back though, when thinking about gender and how you talk about your mother, I thought that was so brilliant because you're speaking about your mother the way that any teenager, any person in their early 20s or young child does as well. She's not quite present in your life in the early days. When you're a preteen teenager, there's almost this fractured relationship between you and your mother. And when you get older, or later on in the book, older, and your mother is also older, that's when you come back together, and it's done through this storytelling aspect of it. But my question for you as well is, when you talk about your mother, there's almost this, my mother was a nurse, she worked really hard, but when everybody else talked about your mother in Nigeria, she was a strong, powerful woman.
Mythic.
Right, like she was incredible. No one had ever seen a woman of her grace and caliber before. So I'm curious about that choice as well, and how you decided to paint your mother. You saw your mother as just a mom, right? But then everybody else was bringing in this grandiose description of her.
Yeah. And I'm also at points disappointed that she's not those things everyone is saying. She's not the person in the pictures. Well, if you choose to have children enter your life at some point, one of the great disappointments will be that after a certain point, they don't see you as a hero. It's very common for kids to just have no idea what their parents are doing outside. I wanted to tell the story of someone who didn't realize that this person around him taking care of him, or who was in and out, was doing so much. And that's something that we often never pay attention to. We never notice, right? So I'm hearing people say how great she is, but I don't see that. I see someone who's working all the time and who won't talk about the genocide, who won't talk. So I don't think that's unusual for kids to just not quite get the significance of their parents at a certain point, right? But I also use that as a way to tell the story, because that's how the story of my mother and my father came to me early, right? Mom, what's going on? She's not telling me anything. I now understand it's trauma. I now understand why she's not telling me this stuff. But as a kid, you're like, how dare you not tell me, right? I'm the first son of the first son. I'm a boy, I need to know these things. But she won't tell me. But at the same time, everyone is saying stuff. And the fact that they're saying things will inspire me to dig deeper, right? And that will ultimately inspire us to come together and share these stories. Although when we do, it's not smooth, right? But it's real. It's absolutely real.
later in life.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, I've been given the sign that it's my time to come off the stage. I have about 7 more questions, but I'll email you.
Yes, please. You always can.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Chude-Sokei.
Thank you for those wonderful
Of
questions.
course, of course. I'll make my way off.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Ken, you're killing me.
Had to get a little Bowie in there for the good professor and pull in a little bit of that reggae. This is Space Oddity. Been done a lot of different ways, a lot of different times, but I love this version that we got right here.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Move with that.
Commencing countdown engine.
How
All
would we know
right,
that
I
it
think we're gonna
started? They'll
fade
give the
out and
signal,
we
I
are
suppose.
ready
They'll give us the
for
signal
our next crew
that they-
to come on in. I'm kicking it right back to the stage.
But when do they, I guess when it starts.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're on. It's lovely to be here, Louis.
Oh, thank you for coming. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much I admire this book. I think it's extremely complex and subtle, but so much of what is said in a very nuanced way. It opens up lots of perspectives for me. And one thing I guess I'd start off, I'll jump straight into it because Archelle sort of, raised so many sort of rich and interesting questions that I feel I should just kind of cut to the chase a little and say that, you talk about diaspora in this book, and you talk about communities that are sort of arriving in the United States in the period after decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean through the 50s, the 60s. What I was struck by, and I like this very much, but I wanted to sort of get you to talk a little more about it, is the degree to which the different stories that are told, and there are many, many stories, they never become part of a whole, as it were. That I think this is one of the things that you were holding on to. So for instance, I'm just thinking of Aunt Carmen and Tante, for instance. They're both sort of mentor figures in DC when you first arrive, but you also say that it's not entirely clear if their experiences spoke to each other.
Exactly. Or literally they even spoke to each other.
Or even they, yeah, right. So I'm sort of curious if you could say a little more about this in light of a whole host of things that come up in the book, not least of which is, Ojukwu coming to your home in LA at the end of the book and talking about this is the vision of Pan-African, Pan-Africanism. And so sort of in light of what I've just said, it would appear that what he says there is ironic, as it were, or possibly could be read in an ironic light.
Well, I'll start by going to the end. If there is a moment of enlightenment in the book, it's the moment when I realize, or where I at least say, that the problem is trying to create a whole. And so much of the book is me looking at diaspora as a way of assembling this puzzle, right, of differences held together by race or white supremacy or colonization or slavery or the relationship between slavery and colonization, and constantly finding out that they don't actually sync up in these either essentialist ways or even strategic ways, right? And discovering at the end of the book that maybe the problem is in trying to create a whole. What if you allow these things to sort of be in these different spaces and conflict and blend and not blend? At the very least, you'll have less headaches, right? And so that's what I end up with in the book. But it's also for me an understanding of diaspora, particularly the Black diaspora, because it is driven increasingly by a desire to see a kind of unanimity, right? And even though in the wake of Paul Gilroy and others, we tend to focus on, differences and diversity, I think we actually do that. I think we say that whenever we're being critiqued. In fact, we do think of diaspora as the last gasp of solidarity. Yeah. And that's something that this book is attempting to critique. We don't need solidarity in that way in order to function in a Pan-African context.
Yeah, I think, just taking up that thread, what struck me about the book, at times it seemed as if the diasporic African communities, the communities from the Caribbean who gather around the table are sort of setting up Black America as its other.
As
This
its
is
other,
this is
absolutely.
this is the majoritarian sort of vision that that refuses to listen to our stories,
Yes.
and that we have to sort of assert ourselves in distinction to against
We
this.
must listen to theirs, but they won't listen to
They won't
ours.
listen to
Yeah.
ours, right? But it seems to me that in much of the telling of the story, you are also suggesting that each and every one of these elders, comes to regard you with disappointment because you are not sort of adhering to the story, or the one story that
Exactly.
they are committed to, that they are carrying with them, be it famine or starvation or civil war or disappointment.
Yes.
And so, in a sense, maybe this goes to the contrarian sort of aspect of your middle name. That one of the things I wondered is, in fact, you were suggesting that a way of navigating this is to, in a sense, find a language with which you can not harmonize discord, but sort of merely navigate them, sort of
Yes.
create a sort of a series of threads through which different things can be put on in perspective and juxtaposed.
And contextualized. I mean,
Mhm.
to put it back in the sphere of family and see how that can help us think in terms of the broader discourse. You are not going to tell a product of a genocide that they should care about white supremacy in America, right? Maybe their children will be sympathetic to it, but to people for whom their wounds are so fresh, right? Or people who feel as if somehow to think about other people's wounds is going to be sort of diminishing of their own. That's something I encountered in the family table all the time, not only in the context of African Americans and American racial politics, but the Caribbean aunts and the Nigerian aunts and the Gabonese aunts, right? For example, the one aunt who says to my mother, "You guys are lucky. At least you know your father is dead." Ours, we don't know, right? So these kind of back and forth comparisons they represent for me a refusal to either be sensitive to or open up to other people's traumas, right? And as the young man in this narrative growing up, you can't harmonize these multiple traumas. At least I couldn't harmonize them, especially since as the young person coming up, to try to challenge them politically was to offend them deeply because you're a child. You don't talk to older people like this, right? You don't tell them that you're fighting against the ghetto because the ghetto is white supremacy. They don't even think this is the ghetto because where they came from was far superior to South Central Los Angeles, right? So much of the book is me trying to find ways of harmonizing it, but after a point you realize you just have to navigate it. At least that's what happens for me as the character. You have to navigate it. And you have to also acknowledge that some of the ideological superstructures that we use to make sense of it work for political purposes, right? But I don't know that they work in terms of how we bring people together socially and culturally, right? I find that to do the latter requires more navigating, right, than the sort of large scale pontificating about unity, which is why I say at the end of the book, realizing after my godfather, the former head of state, right, the former head of state of a nation that was massacred by people of the same race, but still a genocide, right? For him to see a Pan-African vision around the dining table of people just arguing with each other and insulting each other, for me, it was not so ironic if you read it as him celebrating the endless bickering. That's what I thought that my godfather was celebrating. I'm like, the only thing worth celebrating here is relentless back and forth bickering and argument, right? And then for me, I was like, well, then that's diaspora, right? That's diaspora.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe I can sort of change tack a little bit and ask you about kind of a sort of maybe a pivot that I saw in the book and see if what you make of it, because I thought there were two interesting moments early on. One was the chapter, I think it's Suffragette City, where the N word is sort of hurled at
Yes.
at the protagonist, and Tante tells him this is what you will repeat to him when you see him next. And that sort of lands him in trouble when he in fact does so. And then subsequent to that is you're sort of taking part in a poetry competition, and the teacher says to you that Martin Luther King did not die for you. he died for me, or some such thing, and that you, because you were from Uganda and places like that, Biafra, these are places where all these bad things are happening, and it's nothing to do with the history of Black people in the US. And those two things, those two episodes sort of traumatize you in a profound way, and you end up sort of with this vision of calentura. You talk about the fever delirium, and you speak about David Bowie as a way of floating. The floating becomes a way of navigating these two sorts of different groups, or sort of trying to situate you in these disparate stories into which you don't see yourself fitting. But then against that is, in fact, what seems to be, so that's a sort of a moment of sort of uncertainty, if you like. But against that is the episode with the coach, which Archelle talked about a little bit. And you talk about that scene as sort of the transition between persona to self.
Yes.
And it seemed to me that the science fiction literature was, in fact, the space in which a self was actually being created.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So if one were to sort of go somewhere and say, where is the identity of this hero? The identity is in the resources that he discovers in the literature that sort of that he finds, and that literature then sort of provides him with something like a vocabulary to navigate these stories.
And keep in mind, the reason that Bowie matters so much in the narrative is that Bowie authorized science fiction. All of the songs were basically science fiction, right? And for someone growing up in a context where science fiction, right now I'm involved in the whole Afrofuturist world now, and now it's kind of cool and hip to be a Black person reading science fiction. Trust me, it was not that way back in those days. But to have such a public figure who was seen as white and queer, right? People forget that. David Bowie was the first pop star to say he was gay, right? Publicly, right? But deeply science fictional, but also extremely elegant, a narrative of someone who not just floated, but refused to come down, right? The alien who refused to assimilate, who desired to create something on his own kind of cultural sensibilities. That authorized the science fiction books, which the coach, of course, gave me because we were too poor for me to get that stuff. So that was a very big part of it. This is before I discovered Prince. I mentioned Prince a little bit in the book, but I just want to say to everyone who's reading the book, for us, Prince was the Black Bowie, right? But we didn't know that initially. So Bowie gets props, but Bowie led me to Prince at the time. But Bowie enabled this sense of reinvention as, in fact, identity. And there was no one else at the time that did that. And there were no novels at the time that celebrated that, celebrating, becoming a machine, or becoming a different kind of creature, or mutating and morphing. That was very attractive to me in science fiction and in the work of someone like David Bowie. So if someone were to look for the resources of what identity became for me, it would be these narratives of endless transformation, but endless transformation without apology and with a kind of elegance and hauteur, right? That's an important part, right? We may be marginalized, but we don't want you anyway, right? That was crucial.
Yeah, it's funny. What you're saying sort of makes me think of something about your book, the tone and the style it was written in, that there is a kind of reserve. There's a fundamental reserve about the book. You deal with very intense passions, but there is always the sense in which there is I won't use hauteur, but since you've thrown the word out, it's a bit like Bowie standing before the crowd and not bowing to them. He's not performing to them. He simply just disappears after the performance. There is a sense of, one of the things I was struck by with the stories, and this really came through for me, especially with your mother, the way you write about your mother. There is I know that there is resentment that you're punishing her for, having abandoned you in Jamaica. But there is also in that relationship, in particular in the way in which she relates herself to you, a kind of reserve as well, that she is not willing. She feels upset, but there is also a sense in which both of you maintain a certain reserve in the ways in which your relationship develops.
Yes.
And I felt that that was sort of evoked very powerfully through the style of the book.
Incredibly insightful of you, because having written the book and crafted the style, I ended the book realizing I sound like my mother, because that's actually who she was. There was that reserve. We could call it British, stereotypically British, but it was the Englishness that was generated in the colonies, right? And she was that kind of British, the kind of reserve, the distance, talking about deep and complicated and painful things, but also maintaining a space that becomes in America, that hauteur, in America becomes a critique of that over-emotional sense that folks in the Caribbean and folks in the UK, or the British folk, always blame the Americans for being just way too in their feelings, right? And by not doing that, you offer a critique of the country you're in, right? That, I think, really impacted how I structured the narrative, because the book is really me trying to tell the story of my mom. And so it ended up, I think, mimicking how she would have written the book had she wanted to write the book. And she did want a book like this to be written before she died.
Yeah.
She knew she couldn't write it, but in telling me so many of the stories, I'm pretty sure I picked up her tone. I thought that I mastered it in the conversations with her, but I now realize that it actually spreads throughout the whole narrative.
Yeah, you feel that sort of that shift happen, after you get to after the halfway point of the story, when you are discovering your identity as a young man in LA. And there's a much more sort of argumentative sort of style that emerges, whereas the first half of the book is extraordinarily evocative, because so much of it is sort of, very sort of finely balanced between your feelings and your mother's feelings, and so much that is unsaid is sort of produced through these very interesting emotional juxtapositions. And so I thought you could say a little bit about your mother, because it struck me that she is an immigrant in different senses of the word.
Absolutely.
Her story feels exorbitant, exotic, even within the many histories of decolonization I've read about, because she's from Jamaica, so she grows up in a British colony,
Yes.
goes to London, but then relocates to Nigeria and participates in a creation of a new nation.
Yes.
As a Jamaican woman.
As a Jamaican woman.
Who, as you said, was there for too short a time for anyone to discriminate against her, because the period in which Biafra existed was a very short one.
Very, very short.
And then she sees it sort of destroyed and wants to be buried there at the end of her life. So I can't really, she doesn't fit any types I know.
She doesn't fit any types I know either, or that I knew. When I first started trying to tell these stories, it seemed that I would have to write multiple books, because her story just seemed so big. And I don't think that this book is actually fully her story. I could only tell enough of her story to evoke bigger possibilities and try to shape my relationship to these stories as my story. But that is the relationship I had with my mother and my father. My father as, a titanic cultural figure. In fact, it's very difficult to be in Nigeria for me, because he's still a titanic cultural figure in certain parts of the country, and my godfather too. And so I'm relentlessly seen in relationship to them. But my mother's impact was equally powerful, right? It was equally powerful. So her story can't be told fully. Maybe it could occupy a large book, but it doesn't fit any types, because I don't actually understand everything. I don't understand how someone so religious, who grew up such a good girl, quote unquote, would within 6 weeks marry not only some man, but an African who she had been trained from childhood to look down on. Africans for Caribbeans of her generation were beyond the pale. But for her, he was a gentleman. He was epic. He was Dr. Zhivago, as she mentions in the book, right? Super romantic. But then I don't know what happens to make her go from having the prejudices against Africans to Biafra, where she then participates in the creation of a country and then spends the rest of her life mourning the loss of that country, right? I don't have the full story.
Yeah. There's something really quite heroic, because at one point, I think it's Aunt Ngozi who says that only a hero can become someone else. And that sort of strikes me, it strikes a chord with what you said earlier about the shape-shifting quality
Shape-shifting.
that you were trying to aspire to. So there's a sort of an interesting resonance there too.
And it's something I didn't know as a child. I didn't know
Mhm.
that she was shape-shifting herself.
Mhm.
It's something I discover later on. And then I'm impressed by it. I'm inspired by it. But as a kid, you're like, they're saying these things about her. She's not saying much here. I'm just seeing her crying and coming home from work at 3 a.m. I don't see the connection. Later on, I begin to see that, well, she became multiple things, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to shapeshifters, though, if you're a proper shapeshifter, and I'm thinking of Bowie, the real rationale behind shapeshifting might be shapeshifting. Trying to find a core reason why a shapeshifter changes shape it might be not a very productive right thing to try to explore. Shapeshifters maybe change shape initially because of some particular moment or some particular trauma or some particular opportunity. Then they may do it for the second time because it worked well the first time, or they want to do it better the second time. But then eventually, it's just a thing they do. It's just a thing they do. And that's what I liked about Bowie. And that's really how I structured the book, but it's very much how I've structured my life. It's just looking back at all of the things that I made myself become, right? And then at the end of the book, you stop and you go, oh my God, does that mean I'm American?
Yeah, but it's also interesting because your middle name, I mean, I think as Robert was alluding to earlier, actually sort of could be badly translated as contrarian or something, that you are always, as it were, questioning and speaking against
People
the grain.
think I made that up because it seems too convenient. I'm like, I did not make it up because it was deeply traumatic. To spend your whole life thinking your name meant voice of the people and trying to become politicized as the voice of the people. And then you go back as an adult to Nigeria and they go, oh no, your name actually means the opposite of that. It's taken a long time for me to be able to sort of laugh at it. And in fact, it took this book for me to be able to laugh at it. I wrote the book and I'm like, yeah, this is actually quite funny. It's actually quite funny, but not at the moment when you discover it. It just destroyed me.
Yeah, I mean those scenes. I mean, it's those scenes that in Nigeria are very unsentimental. It seems as if even though you're going back to to bury your mother with your father, and even though you're being received as the son of this great man, it also feels like it almost parallels the earlier episode in Jamaica when you're recovering from that horrific sort of head injury.
Yes.
And so it doesn't necessarily mean that that leaves America as home, but it certainly seems it leaves the reader with a sense of a sort of I would say a disaffected sort of quality in both those spaces. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, disaffected in both those spaces, Nigeria, Jamaica, but also the United States, right? I mean, the book does not arrive at the United States as this sort of triumphalist space of arrival. It's just sort of like, man, this is where I've ended up, right? And where I've been able to work out these things. But I didn't want to romanticize Nigeria or Jamaica because that's not the experience I had. But I also didn't want to fall into the cliches of describing those places in ways that we're used to hearing from either white writers or Black or Caribbean or South Asian writers who go back home and it destroys them because it's so terrible, right? That's a cliche as well, right? I wanted to do something quite different that spoke to my actual experiences in those places. I was in the hospital in Jamaica because I almost died, and that's the experience I had. I had a massive head injury, and so I saw everything through this sort of hallucinatory, screen, right? But then also the same thing in Nigeria. I arrived in Nigeria fully aware that I was going to fail their expectations. There's just no way I could live up to those expectations. And so one of the ways to deal with this sense of imminent failure is you drink a lot. And so much of that narrative is dealing with alcohol, especially since so many traditional Igbo rituals of welcome feature hard liquor, right? So you're constantly being given alcohol. And that just became a way to tell the story of acknowledging the impendingness of your failure.
Yeah. that's fascinating. Yeah, I think it really gives this idea of home and identity and belonging a very interesting twist. For precisely that reason, it's not as if you're disillusioned by any of this. It's more that it sort of adds a kind of a layer of complexity to experience. In a sense, in the way in which I think, as you were sort of saying earlier, conversations about diaspora do not often there's this sort of a sense of a kind of an orthodoxy, if you like. You celebrate
Absolutely,
it, right?
absolutely.
Hybridity is by definition a good thing.
Yes.
It's about it's the opposite of being an identity-based sort of type, when in fact it's a different kind of identitarianism at times.
Which is the point.
And when you sort of have a problem with that, you end up sort of becoming very critical of these kinds of questions. And so it seems to me that there is a way in which you're navigating these questions that lend themselves to a sort of a language which is not about identity anymore. It's really about a willingness to take on contradiction, which I think the reader can sort of really learn from.
Well, I hope the reader can really learn from it. People for whom identity is the solution to one's problem will not learn from the book, or might be hostile or resistant to it. But yeah, it's about transformation and being at ease with the inevitability of transformation. It's the idea, it's an attempt to tell the story of transformation and change without loss, right? Mm-hmm. I think that that's what really holds people to some of these narratives, right? That transformation and change imply loss of authenticity or orthodoxy. Well, not necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's a really that's a very interesting way to sort of end things. I think our time is up. This was such an interesting conversation, Louis.
Oh, thank you, Sanjay.
And I hope there'll be many more to come over the course of coffees when COVID the COVID era is finally.
My second shot is on Monday.
Congratulations.
So you get yours so we can go out.
Okay, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we take you to Ghana, a little high life, a little jazzy music, a lot of guitars. Listen to it. This is from a playlist that was put together by Michael Berenbaum Quintero. He is an associate professor here at Boston University, an associate professor of music, also chair of musicology and ethnomusicology here as well. We asked him to put together a playlist for the most floating in a most peculiar way, and this is the most peculiar playlist as a part of it. Listen in a little bit. And you can go ahead and dance too if you'd like to do that. It's all right. Go ahead and get up. No one can see you except me. It's all right. All right, why don't I take you now to Jamaica? A little dance hall. Different kind of swing with this. And momentarily, we are going to have Ha-Jin and Robert Pinsky in conversation with Louis Chude-Sokei. Give us a moment, and we'll be better. Especially as you groove through some of this music here.
The foolish man house is washed away. How could the wise man build his house on the sand?
All right, I'm gonna take you back to the stage.
Oh, I should take off my hat too, right? Okay.
Archelle Thelemaque covered so much. I thought, well, that student has now covered everything I thought I had to say. And then Sanjay made me think of other things I hadn't realized I wanted to say. And I'll hope that Ha-Jin helps us find some new territory. I found myself thinking toward the end of your conversation with Sanjay, I asked myself a question I can't answer, which is, does the word diaspora have an opposite? And the opposite, I don't mean return.
Yeah.
And I immediately thought of two words I've always disliked. Assimilation, which is humiliating, you just become like somebody else.
Yeah.
And the other word, appropriation, which is also an ugly word.
I'm not a fan of it. Yeah.
I don't like it. And in my own writing recently, I found myself engaging those two terms and saying, well, I didn't like them. And said, if I had to, I would read instead breaking and entering.
Outright theft.
But yes, and cosmopolitanizing, there is no word for it. And that's appropriate because you're saying that solidarity has to be based on something, but not on stasis.
Yeah.
And it's that word has no opposite, maybe creation or something, emphasizes how important the process is that we have no name for. And frankly, I feel like whatever that thing is, I'm sort of feeling, I feel like rather Manichaean. It's in a battle with fascism.
Yes. Yes.
And the outcome, I say Manichaean because we don't know what the outcome will be. And on the one side, there is something fascistic in our country. And the other side, there's something I believe in deeply that I have no name for.
In fact, in Chinese language, they invented the word. So like a centralization, something like that, the
Yes.
opposite. So basically, they translate diaspora as scattered.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
scattered.
Scattered.
Yes.
So, well, the opposite of diaspora as scattering
Yes.
would be place,
Yeah.
staying in stasis.
Yeah.
perhaps.
Creating,
Right.
Yes.
participating in the creation, in the ongoing
Well,
creation.
Yeah.
Yes, in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the diaspora, I think, certainly in the academic context, but diaspora was meant to critique this notion that anyone or anything just came from that place,
yes.
just
Yes.
sprung up like leaves from the
Yes.
ground,
Yes.
which of course is the fiction.
Yes.
Because the beauty of diasporic thinking is to remind us that we're all diaspora.
And also, there's a sense of voluntary displacement.
Yes,
They de-emphasize this. This is very important concept.
it's, in the memoir, one of the differences between the Black immigrant and the
Yeah,
African
yeah,
American is the voluntary versus
Voluntary,
involuntary.
yes.
voluntary.
The least possible
Yes.
will
Mhm.
compared to this other thing, which could be related to what you said at the end of that conversation with Sanjay, that it's a form of shapeshifting.
Yeah,
Yes.
I've been this,
Yes,
now
yeah.
I'll be that.
Yeah.
and to speak of shape shifting in a sort of affirmative and
and just-
powerful way.
One of the human instincts,
But
one
that's
of
the
the
diff-
things we do.
But that's the difficult thing. The difficult thing is in the context of like a racial dominance and hierarchies, change and claiming the new thing is sometimes seen and held with suspicion,
Yes. Yes.
right? Because you're betraying or abandoning
Yeah.
something that was fought so hard to establish,
Yes.
right? And so that's where shapeshifters and let's just call them, I don't know, nationalists, right?
Yeah.
Always have a real tension.
I don't know enough about Bowie, but maybe declining to come back down, to choosing to stay in the capsule that is self-created
Mhm.
and is alien to that. Young Americans,
Ah,
that maybe that young Americans, it's ironic, he's not an American, he's no longer exactly young,
that's
but,
right.
but it means, on the other hand, I've listened to reggae, I've listened to soul music, I've listened to show tunes, I've been in many different cultures, I've been up and I've been down, and there's some things I will descend to.
Yes. Well, there's the thing about that particular album, what's so great. We forget that Bowie did this Young Americans album after hanging out with African-American R&B artists in Chicago and Philadelphia, right? But here's the important thing about that. It's about someone who is not an American. and pretending to be one.
Yeah.
And how do you become an American? Well, you hang out with Black people.
Yeah, that's true.
You dress the way they dress, you learn how they walk. So it's not, it's shape-shifting again, but
Yes.
targeted shape-shifting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And at least, as you said, this is where I wound up,
Where we wound up.
and which is what I think is true of culture generally.
Oh, absolutely.
It's,
So
I'll
your mother
make the-
played a big role in this, I think, right?
Yes.
So I'm very fascinated by your mother. And she's torn by two lands. So really she challenges the idea of home.
It's
Apparently she stay as a day job worker.
mhm,
And that's tough life, but
Oh, yeah.
she has a different status, right?
mhm.
And,
Well, for me, but again, I was talking earlier about how a lot of the story is not recognizing what the parents offer.
yes.
And
yes.
one of the things about the book is I try to tell the story of not understanding that home is whatever she created for me.
Yes.
But you, as a kid, you're like, no, home is the guys on the street, or home is this, or
Yeah,
home is that.
yeah.
So I'm glad you bring that up, because she's not on every page,
No.
but she's the point of every page.
Yes. And big figure looming behind everything.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
she really, it seems to me, she really challenged the idea home.
Yes.
America is not exactly home for
No.
her, but she understands that's for you. So I think that the traditional, very often, in fact, the old way in Asian, even in Homer, and this is a word like this, like anchorage.
Mhm,
Odysseus often thanked his host for anchorage.
mhm.
So in a way, for your mother, it's like a displacement, but voluntary.
Interesting. Home as, I guess it's connected to shape-shifting, but for my mother, because she had been displaced multiple times,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
Home for me was her, whatever she
Yes,
did.
yes,
But as I got older, I began to understand that, well, this may not be my home. She's also telling me, well, this is not really your home.
okay. Yes, that's my sense. For her, America is not a home, but it's good place for you.
It's a good place. Exactly. It's not your home, but it's a good place for you.
Yes.
You'll go back home eventually, right? Or maybe not.
or home
Right.
is theoretical. Home
Yes.
is,
It's a feeling.
But
Home is-
but not for my mother. I wouldn't
it's-
say theoretical. I would say feeling.
feeling.
Definitely a feeling.
I'm thinking about impurity,
Ah,
that
well,
home is never purely at home.
yeah.
Mhm.
And there's that, for me, one of the big things I managed to learn was Levi Strauss
Mm.
in Tree Stroke
Mm.
Peak. There's this story that, oh, at the other end of the river, beyond the mountain, there are people who have never had any contact with the rest of the world. They're
Mhm.
pure.
Yeah.
They're only pure. And then always, when the daring anthropologist gets there and is careful not to even exhale because this is so pure.
Mhm.
And then in this very intricate ritualistic object, there are little soda cap bottles
Of course.
or little bits of printed material or that culture is wanton and promiscuous.
That's a word I like to use to describe culture. You know, I think about some of these ancient Igbo and West African burial grounds where they find old ancient Chinese coins.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
And they're like, well, how pure could this
Yeah.
culture be?
If you read about Ishi,
Yeah.
Ishi of Berkeley, California,
Mhm, yes.
the last of his people, it's a very moving story. But the more people study the artifacts, I mean, he went hunting, he made friends with people who go hunting with him. The arrow was not really an arrow that was the people, supposedly his people. He was a mixture.
Sure.
Yeah.
Aren't we all?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that which is pure is that where we've forgotten
Yeah.
its history of
I'm
mixture?
afraid I go back to that being an ugly word
Yeah.
with a very bad political history.
Well, right now, as he began with this
Yes.
fear
Oh, yeah,
of
I can't-
fascism, that's all rooted
That's
in an
pure-
obsession with
sure.
purity.
Purity-
Yeah, purity,
Purity is a
centrality.
very, very pernicious
Yeah.
idea
Oh, absolutely.
associated with that.
Absolutely. Purity and its relationship to those who are impure,
Mhm.
and you say centrality,
Yeah.
authorizing power in a certain
Yeah.
way. Oh, yeah.
I really enjoyed the book a lot. I have more questions about your mother.
Oh, please.
So
please.
I
I feel like I've done a good job for my mother to be out there in the world.
And you carry out her wish to ship her cremains back
Yes.
to
Yes.
not her native land, but her
But her
husband.
home.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yes, but she has another land, right? And so that's why her attitude and her emotion for America must be very complicated.
Yes.
In a way, I could feel he was torn by two places. But either place could be her homeland.
Mhm.
But she preferred to stay here. Partly for you, I guess.
Exactly. For me, absolutely. But, but that's why the Biafra thing, I mean, we can get really theoretical here when we think about the country that was called Biafra.
Yes.
This is a woman who was from Jamaica, moved to the UK, and then migrated to Nigeria, and then joined the Biafra movement,
Yes.
right? So she chose finally a home,
A destiny.
a destiny.
almost,
She
yeah.
chose, and it's Biafra, but it
Yes.
lasted 3 years.
I know. That's
three or 4 years.
That's why, when she said the country is killed,
Yes.
it was very shocking phrase.
Yeah.
But it lasted for 4 years for her. But I think I try to suggest that for her, that's the home is the one she chose.
In
Yes.
that context, the opposite of diaspora is autonomy.
Yes,
Yeah.
For her,
for her.
at that moment, it was not assimilation, it was not appropriation.
It was a
not-
specific
it was saying,
place.
Yes.
I-
Your choice.
I'm
choice.
choosing. I am
Yeah.
autonomous and this is my allegiance.
And it's interesting because there's that moment in the book where I'm called the N-word and my aunts start telling me what to say.
Yes,
You're
I
not
know.
descended, no, you're not descended from slaves.
You know? But then remember the last line in the mantra, the last line is, "We came here by choice."
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because for them, it's a big part of their
Big,
identity.
yes, it's a big deal. Big deal.
No, but
Those
I'm glad.
aunties, they're like Dickens characters. They're so vivid. They just,
And I wanted to give the impression that wherever you are in the world, whether you're displaced or whatever, there's one thing that you can always count on: aunties.
yeah.
Yes.
There's always aunties around. And so, I mean, looking back on it, one could say that diaspora is just these aunties spread out over
Yes.
these multiple cultures.
Yeah.
Right? But as a young boy, again, I stress that as a young boy, we don't realize how it's not just that women make the world, right, for children, but women make diaspora.
Yeah, yeah.
That whole map of diaspora is all aunties.
And
right?
there's a development, the young boy's mentality or psychology. At one point, he told his fellow, and he didn't know where he was from.
Mm.
And the guy responded, "You are the luckiest man in the world." Very simple sentence, but really that shows another ideal state without the burden of the past.
Yes.
Your destiny is to arrive, it's different, not to return.
That's-
This is kind of liberation.
That is, yeah, no, that is, but that's also connected to the shape shifting, right?
I know.
Yes, your destiny is to become something else.
Yes.
Yeah, and at the
yes.
beginning, you're this little child who wants to be the phantom that goes to walk.
Yes, yes.
And who is thinking about the accent of the black actors in
American TV shows.
Yeah.
And then comes the shiny man.
No,
And
it's
it says,
Nigerian.
There's your autonomy. You're making your little
Yeah.
choices.
Right. Nope.
And he's the spirit of diaspora. He
Yep.
says, as well as of Biafra.
Biafra.
He both. And he says, you're the first son of the first son.
Yes.
You're this. And the kid says, what? Talk about the burden of the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's magisterial. He's
Yeah.
impressive. He's military. He's
Yes.
and what? This is the past
Mhm.
in one person.
In one
That's
person.
the whole burden of history. He says, oh, you do you know who you are?
And as I
Help
say
me,
in the book,
help.
what kind of a question is that to ask a kid?
Yeah.
Do you know who you are?
That's
Of
you
course
write
you
that
don't.
exact sentence in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the Biafra thing runs through the whole experience. And that's why it was important to, in life and in the book, return her to
Yeah,
bury her.
related
Yeah.
to that,
Yeah.
you know, Biafra, and also we know the country was destroyed, and but you return her to the ancestral village, and it feels like a closure, but I don't think it is exactly closure. It's something like a semicolon.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm wondering, you know, you have to have you still have your own battle to fight.
It's no, it's this is coming from a writer of fiction in some cases. I appreciate that because the struggle was to make it closure, but not closure.
True.
It ended one cycle of the
Yeah,
story.
you need that. Yes.
You needed that emotional release.
Yes.
Right. But it's also what happened for me in my life. I took her back and buried her there.
Yes.
And then, but of course, on that same trip, you discover that your name is not what you thought it was.
Yes.
Mhm.
And you discover all these other things that are
Yeah.
incomplete.
I
Right.
meant to say it's the last sentence of the book, because you say, found out my true name.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the true name is, yes, the voice of the people, but doesn't say what the people necessarily want.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And the voice couldn't be against the people,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, which is not, it would be easy to say at the end of the book, it's kind of triumphant. As some people have read it that way.
Yeah.
It's not quite
No.
Not quite.
triumphant.
There is a loss, a
It's
lot of
con-
loss.
Yes.
A lot of
Yeah.
loss and a
Yeah.
lot of, as the kids would probably say today, a lot of OMG.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is exactly how it
One
ends.
is a mishmash.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But again, back to the issue of culture, which my mother is so connected to. I think one of the troubles we really do have, and I'm saying this as a scholar, but also a writer, is culture, because it's so constantly changing, right? The good and the bad, the up and the down, the brutality and the beauty, et cetera. The real struggle that we have is always trying to name and define it. That's the real struggle of it, right? And how do we operate politically and culturally if we try not to define the culture that we either represent or are a part of? Because culture is always in excess of who we are.
Yes. Yes. And also to represent something also, there should be a choice. I noticed there are a few writers like Archelle and DJ, or they belong to the Igbo.
Yeah. So do I.
But they write in English. I didn't, maybe I haven't read enough. I didn't feel the struggle for, like a disappeared country. And English, we know it's not a native language. But maybe that's a personal choice.
Well, but that again becomes the Igbo thing. Because one of the things that defines the Igbos, and it's interesting you bring that up, is that they were, I'm sure some out there will disagree with me, but they were one of the first groups, and this is why one of the reasons the Biafra genocide started. The Igbos were the ones who accepted Christianity first.
Yes.
Amongst the earliest, and they accepted the English language.
English language, yes, I know.
and missionary education, which of course put them at odds with the Muslim majority in the north, who were Quranic and even though they were suspicious of sort of British colonialism, they were still seen as favored by the British colonials who gave them more power and weapons, etc. Right? So the choice of language, this sort of choice of, we are Biafrans, we are Africans, but in choosing the English language, we do so without feeling any cultural loss.
Yeah, they're very.
I think it's enriching.
That's how they saw it, which is why now when people complain about African writers, they often complain that too many of them are Igbo.
Right? They're very adaptive, but my impression of the culture is that it's based partly on the dialogue with Saul Bellow of Achebe, but that it's the culture, the Igbo culture somehow decided to be modernist.
Yes, absolutely. In
It
fact,
is whatever you got. Is this modernism? All right, we're going to learn it. we're gonna do it.
Yeah.
or whatever you got, is it successful? Can it be
Yeah,
successful?
sure,
Then
yeah.
it's Igbo.
It's one of the
We will
great answers.
appropriate.
I mean, a stupid thing said by one great writer answered very well by another great writer. Saul Bellow said stupidly, "Where's the African Tolstoy?"
Hmm.
And Achebe said, "The African Tolstoy is Tolstoy."
Is Tolstoy.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
That's one of the best answers.
That is a great
ever.
answer. But let me throw something in that mix too, which, it's mentioned in the book, but people always describe the Igbos as the Jews of Africa,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
For a lot of weird political reasons, but
Yes.
also there are a lot of Igbos that believe, there are people that some of the elders in my family or who I know would always say to me, "You're pronouncing it wrong. It's not Igbo, it's Hebrew."
But look at the country, that English and Christianity really helped the people a lot culturally, economically. We got applications from African, best applicants are from Nigeria.
Well, that's part of the larger story going on
Yeah.
in this book, which is about, so many African immigrants who've come to the United States in the last few decades. Their performance rates in education, in medicine, et cetera, are like through the roof.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to tell people, almost 80% of all Black doctors are Nigerian in America.
This is- well,
Almost
this-
most of the Black students at these universities
Yeah.
are of West African descent.
There's a negative moment in the book
There are a couple.
where you talk about the academic world,
Yeah.
and you're going to do a thesis
That is about
observed things
this.
like that at UCLA.
Yeah.
Why are African immigrants experience so different from the experience of African Americans? And there's a whole funny passage about the two students who side, the African American students and the African American
yeah.
students.
And the African
Organizations that
Yeah.
definitely are very suspicious. But you say there was nobody at UCLA, white or Black, willing to direct that thesis.
in the English department, and I did have to.
At that moment, in
moment.
that English department,
Yeah.
it was forbidden territory.
It was, but out of respect to those who did finally come to my support, I
Yeah.
did find some. I say it in the book. I did find some
Yes,
people,
yeah.
but initially it was considered
Yeah,
hot.
it's an interesting symptom of something.
Well, it's like my cousin right before he goes to jail, or when I talk to him on the phone, when he says to me, his reading of American culture as a Black immigrant was, stop trying to have them, Louis, stop trying to have them pay attention to your story. There's only one story that
Only one
matters in
story.
this country.
Blacks against the whites.
There's only one story. Accept it, become fluent in it, and then you can become powerful using it, right? He just keeps saying that.
Yeah.
Of course, so when my name becomes authentic towards the end of the book, it's because I reject that.
Yeah.
But your scholarship, I assume, also try to strangle
Oh,
both
absolutely.
the diaspora and also African American.
Oh, absolutely.
That really makes the field more vibrant, richer.
I agree. Well, but as you know, as a writer and as a scholar, both of you, trying to enrich things that are sort of established in certain ways requires a lot of stress and a lot of tension, and a lot
Yes,
of back and
yes,
forth.
yeah.
And so, I tell people that this memoir is my first memoir, but my first scholarly book, The Last Darky, is actually the first iteration of this story.
Yes, sure.
It's a story about Black West Indian immigrants who migrate to the United States
Yeah.
in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they have to pass as African Americans, right? And so the book is about Black on Black passing, right?
Yeah.
And how the first major Black minstrel figure was a West Indian performing
In
the white
blackface.
stereotype of
Yeah.
the African Americans in order, he thought, to ennoble and liberate African Americans,
Yeah.
right? I'm sorry, as far as I'm concerned, that's this book. That's the mechanism of shape-shifting and identity and diaspora.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really, very often when we read a memoir, it's a kind of expanded version of a personal diary and genealogy. But this book really, it is layered and really thought-provoking. Think about it. So it really made me aware of a kind of a human condition overlapped, and there are so many shades. Nothing is really clear.
Yes, yes. And I'm really grateful. The main thing I'm most grateful for, and I think it's represented by you folks and Archelle and Sanjay, is I didn't expect that so many people from so many different cultural and intellectual backgrounds would take to the book like they have. It's been quite humbling to hear people who I ostensibly have zero in common with, racially, culturally, socially, etc., feel that they understand this. And I feel
Very
that,
beautiful to hear her say to you, I felt seen by that book.
yes,
Yeah.
and I've done talks where people who are, not anywhere close to my understanding of my possible audience are saying we felt seen,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm just like, wow. Yeah. So we're being told that we're wrapping this up.
Okay. Really, another thing I didn't mention, but I really enjoy the language a lot.
Could you please say that louder? That's really
I
important.
really enjoy there are some very delicious phrasing. For instance, when the coach, middle school coach, gave him a box of science fiction,
Yes.
and he said, I was quibbled with gratitude.
Yes.
See, and there's another moment I said, another student called him the N word. He confronted him, and the boy on the cusp of tears. See,
Yes.
very original use.
Well, the reason I wanted you to say it louder is that when you're telling a story that is pretty intense and complex and epic in the case of my family, you could forget that this is a literary work.
Yes, yes. There are phrases, really delicious phrases here, and that's great. And
Thank you.
like a swirl of mosquitoes. I didn't cross them elsewhere. Only in this book.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, coming from you fellas, that's my work is done.
Yes.
Wow.
Figured we had to get a little young Americans in there. We've heard quite a bit about Bowie as well. Once again, we are working off of the conversation, and we're also working off of a playlist that we got from Professor Michael Berenbaum Quintero, Professor of Music, Associate Professor of Music here, and Chair of the Department of Musicology and Ethnomusicology. We're just getting ready, because momentarily we're going to go into a Q&A where you get a chance to ask some questions of the good Professor Louis Chude-Sokei. So let's just listen to a little David Bowie, and then we'll go into the influence. And there was mention of Prince, and this is one of my favorite Prince songs right here. All right, I think what we're going to do now is we are going to start to fade out so that you can get your questions answered and have a little bit more dialogue. And the dialogue will be moderated, or the Q&A will be moderated by Nick Bates of the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground. Take it away.
All right. Nope. Can you hear me? Nope. All right. All right. So first question up is do you feel that Black people's national origins and cultural diversity are subsumed by the politics of American racial categories? If so, do you think it's possible to make space for those national and cultural differences to be recognized in American discourse?
No, I don't think that they are subsumed. I think that many people assume they are and therefore don't pay attention to the diversity. That's one of the things the book wants to make public, is the fact that we might assume some sort of de facto solidarity, or that racism sort of congeals us into a solidarity or oneness. That actually isn't true. Black diasporic sensibilities and self-definitions don't just vary because of where folks come from. They vary based on their experiences in the United States that shapes them into multiple kinds of identities. The problem is that I don't think we listen to how different those forms of Blackness are. If in fact we can do something about those diversities and bringing them together into some kind of coalition or sense of connection or connectivity, the first thing we'd have to do is acknowledge that they exist as different. And I don't think that's actually happening. And that's what I wanted this book to celebrate. Because, you know, if you talk to African Americans about Blackness, and then you talk to Haitians about Blackness, and you talk to children of Haitians about Blackness, or Nigerians, et cetera, you're getting quite different things. And I think that we have failed in understanding that solidarity is something that you continually and constantly have to actively create and shape through work. I think there's so much laziness around our racial assumptions. We assume that Blackness does all the work. It does not. It does not do all the work.
Next question up. Control is a big theme throughout the memoir. However, it seems in the sexual encounters detailed that you were without control. What is the significance of these encounters in your perception of control?
Those encounters are the encounters of a child, a young person who we know have A, not much control, or B, less control than they think they have, right? And so the significance of control in those scenes is just to tell the story of how sexuality is being sort of formed and shaped in totally different contexts outside of the control of the adults and the families who may have very orthodox religious notions of sexuality. What they don't know is what's going on in the bedrooms or in the living rooms. And that shapes who we are as not just beings, but as sexual beings, right? Not just the lack of control vis-a-vis the people, you know, who are using me for sexual purposes, right? But also the lack of control that parents have over their children, right? One of the most difficult things about having published this book is people who I grew up with reading those sections are shocked, right? And I'm like, it's because you thought you had control. And what I'm telling you is that you did not, right? And so the back and forth between being the desire for power and the sense of powerlessness, I think that runs throughout the whole narrative in terms of the kind of person that I become. But I think that that's common for us all.
Next question up. The most incandescent writing in the book for me is the chapter in Jamaica, where you were sent by your mother a second time and where you suffer a grievous injury. But this episode never seems to enter the conversations, the reviews around floating in a most peculiar way. What do you say?
What do I say about it not appearing in the conversations, or what do I say about that scene? It doesn't appear in the critical responses, except for maybe a line or two, grievous violence in Jamaica. But when I talk to people about the book, for many people, they say that that is the single most powerful scene for them, right? Whereas for the Nigerians, it's the Biafra stuff. For Black folks dealing with cultural politics, it's the African Americans at the dining table or the Black Student Association, right? But people who are alien to all of that, it's the injured person in a hospital who has lost track of past, present, and future and what's going on. And the violence done to that child, but also the violence done in the hospital, right? That tends to stand out for a lot of people. I think one of the reasons that a lot of critics have not identified that scene is not because they haven't liked it, they certainly have, thank God, but because it seems to stand outside of conventional or outside of the book's conversations about race in ways that people understand, right? And that's one of the reasons I had that section in there. It actually happened, I still have the scar, but it's about race and identity and being an American or being mistaken for an American or not being sure if I'm American anymore because of my head injury, right? But it's just this little scene that is about a kind of a whole new world of people who are all brutalized, bandaged, burned, cut, abused. And for a moment, I describe it as home because I've lost my memory and I don't know where else I belong, right? That for me signals a very important emotional resting place in the book. It's also a transition because when I come back is when I decide to become much more an American.
You said earlier that this book is for those who are not academic. Are there themes and topics you were not able to discuss at length because of this choice?
Well, it's, again, it is for academics who, you know, read memoirs and literary work. When I say it's not for academics, it's because academic language, which I'm fluent in, is language that requires a kind of ideological front loading. And you're here to analyze and to explain. What a memoir allows me to do is have my cousins and my uncles talk and say things that are wildly inappropriate, but poetically they work, right? But I don't explain or analyze or contextualize, right? I don't editorialize, right? That's what a memoir allows me to do. And I get to say things that we don't get to talk about in the public sphere of academic and political conversation. But on the other hand, I don't get to explain. If I'm, to be a good writer, you're not explaining, well, the reason he said this was because of this and because of that, right? I don't get to do that, but I don't want to do that in this book because I do that elsewhere.
Unlike contemporary memoirs of its kind, this memoir does not offer a framework or path toward anti-racism. Why is that?
It doesn't do that simply because I believe that there is no explicit agreed upon definition of anti-racism that Black people universally agree to. And those who would like to suggest that anti-racism is a specific technique, methodology, direction, path, or politics, I find dangerous and suspicious. This book does not do that because it does not believe in any conscriptive notion of racism or anti-racism, especially since it comes from people from different parts of the world who process white supremacy in quite different ways, who respond to it upon arrival in quite different ways. And these are not one-offs, these are not rare individuals. They are a great many of our new American people who see race and racism in quite distinct ways. So I deliberately do not do that because it is not something that I'm committed to, this notion of there being a specific trajectory of anti-racism.
Last question, right? Last question. Howard Thurman, right? We're in the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground, so we'd be remiss to not ask a question related to Howard Thurman. Often in his career, specifically in different texts, he talks extensively about the connection between love and reconciliation and how at times they are reciprocal, but also at times they're one and the same.
Yeah.
So I would ask you this question: what did writing this memoir teach you about love and reconciliation?
It taught me that that with love, you don't need reconciliation, with reconciliation, right? And sometimes you can reconcile without love, right? One of the finest reviews of this book was one that's concluded with the idea that the book tells you about how we hurt each other, right? We don't forgive each other, but we still can carry each other with these wounds unhealed. I thought that was the most insightful description of what I try to achieve here. And that's my answer to the love and reconciliation. I don't think that we all necessarily, like, I don't think I reconciled with my family but that should not suggest that there's no real love there, right? And then there are people who I reconciled with around racial politics in the book, right? Right, who I certainly don't love because I still think they're actually racist. But we still reconciled. And that kind of ambivalence and ambiguity is necessary for me as a writer, but I think it's necessary for us as a culture, which goes back to the previous question.
My sincerest thank you to our colleague, friend, and author, Louis Chude-Sokei, for this very personal and thoughtful-provoking memoir. And thank you to all of the distinguished participants this evening, Archelle Thelemaque, Robert Pinsky, Sanjay Krishnan, Ha Jin, and Ken Elmore. In closing, I want to remind us that there is value in all of the communities we share membership in. I would like to also offer this quote from Dr. Howard Thurman's book, The Search for Common Ground. And I quote, "It may be that man's experience of himself as a child of nature and the long journey of his organism to self-consciousness and reflective thought may yield another clue to what seems to be the ground of community in the integrity of life itself." Thank you, our audience, for joining us this evening. And if you haven't already, be sure to read Louis's book, Floating in a Most Peculiar Way. And for more information about the Howard Thurman Center, please feel free to visit our website. Thank you and good night.